experience in Central America refer to be able to effectively train producers on labor and human rights, and to threaten the competitiveness of local agribusiness, connecting them to the responsible value chain. In this panel, we will discuss deeply what are the key human rights issues in this sector, what are the key due diligence considerations we need to take, and what innovations have emerged to address the human rights issues. I would like just to remind the rules of procedures. Then each panelist will have 7 minutes, and each commentator will have 5 minutes. After the presentation, then we will have questions from the floor, and then we will start with questions from the states, followed by business, and then with civil society. Then I am the pleasure to introduce the first panelist, Mr. Nirun Phitakwatchara from the Thailand Human Rights Commission. You have 7 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Excellency, distinguished participants, colleagues, and friends, we are now under the trend of globalization. It is the process that every human being disregarded their races, gender, culture, nationality, or origin difference comes and unite together in order to create a better community for the benefit of everyone. And despite the fact that the relationship between human rights and business is becoming more prominent on the international agenda, there has so far been little attention given to its human rights impact, particularly in those unrich societies, likewise in Southeast Asian countries. Throughout the decade, the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand has received amount of complaints from the local community, showing their suffering from the capitalist economic development policy that exploit their occupation and livelihood. In order to respond to the increase of heavily industrial demand, the capitalist economic development has transformed local land resources, forest and mineral-rich region with commoditization into industrial goods, which in turn also transform the occupation of local people who maintain their earning in agriculture sector for generation from farmer and present to industrial worker by using the capitalist agriculture credit system. In short, the state-run capitalist business and policy has exploited the poverty in local community, while the rich and the bourgeois running the capitalist policy are proposed with wealth and power. This caused the majority of people to become poor and the few bourgeois to become rich. And in order to explain the Thai Human Rights Commission intervention toward transitory cases on business and human rights, I would like to highlight a principal case with current action on basis of the Commission investigation as the agribusiness and human rights, with the case of land concession in Cambodia between Gong community in Cambodia and Thai investor. The Commission has closely cooperated with the Ylva and Southeast Asian Natural Human Rights Institute Forum, CNF, and CREG and Equitable Cambodia and local partner with investigation of this case. The Thai National Human Rights Commission has conducted investigation on this upon scope of geographic area in the Cambodian jurisdiction mentioned in a complaint Gong province, in the district of Sarom Ambro and of Butamskon. Upon the investigation and finding of Thai NHRC, with cooperation on preliminary and comprehensive study on impact of agribusiness investment in those focusing areas committed by the local civil society organization and community-based organization, it finds that the land concession in Gong Cambodia affect to the human rights and dignity, particularly the right to life of local community. It was an indirect impact of the announcement of European Union project in Cambodia, namely Everything But Arms, which gearing up the exploitation of huge plot of land with increase of agribusiness. In March 2006, the Community Congress has improved the Land Concession Act, enabled the land concession on huge plots of land for commercial purpose, including those granted to the private sector. The company therefore claimed the proprietary right over the land in Gong, which account for 19,000 hectares in the Salam Ambrong province and Bhutan province, causing 400 families from 3 villages to lose their land. Up to now, 200 families are waiting to reclaim their right over the 1,397.6 hectares of land. Their human rights are systematically violated as the deprivation of right over the land, causing local community to lose their plot of land, were usually being used as rich paddy field and food orchard. The violation of occupational right and right to earning for their life as the land concession has dramatically decreased their self-capacity for income generation. The community government violated the community right by preventing the local community from participate and involvement in the issue, and completely overlooked the people participation process with non-providing of information and update, and not engaging the local community and stakeholder in the decision-making process on land concession. The government also failed to study or compensate for the environmental and health impact on the local community. On the investigation of this case, the Thai National Human Rights Commission has learned more on how to exercise power with challenge against the state jurisdiction through the commitment to promote and protect human rights of people, as well as to monitor the compliance with the standard of international law. We believe that we are in a unique position to focus on the core protection issue faced by our people and to ensure that our people are not violated or discriminating or introducing any violence in the name of business development against people in the other state jurisdiction. So we are applying both legal component and voluntary guidelines as the National Human Rights Commission Act 1999, the Constitution of the Kingdom of Thailand 2007, the Asian Human Rights Declaration, the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for this circumstance. And there are recommendations as follows. Number 1, in the case of Asian Human Rights Declaration, the Asian state party are obliged to reaffirm the civil and political rights of Asian people. Number 2, the Asian state party should encourage long-term and stable community development, which emphasize on the involvement of everyone in the community and for resource management. The development should encourage ethical value in the political sense, which shall consider on 3 main components: as value-based development, cooperation, not competition; profit-based development is the people benefit, and power-based development is decentralization. Number 3, the community and indigenous people thrive. Right should stand for the right to utilize and manage natural resources by the local community. All Indians thrive with the sector to alternate economic system, including their right to respect, to protect their distinctive cultural practice and mode of living. The community right would entitle the local community with more negotiation power in terms of natural resource management and by their right to life and self-determination. Number 4, the EHIA and strategic environment assessment covering a whole affected community and area rather than individual assessment. Number 5, the development toward the green economy, which include the responsibility to soothe the negative effect of environment, upgrade the standard, less for environment impact and health status, and the focusing on the community need to say to more the participation and undertaking the carbon tax regulation.
Sharing with us the lessons learned and experience on land issues. Then I will give you the word to Rafael Maldonado, the Centro de Acción Legal, Ambiental y Social de Guatemala.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, dear members of the panel. For the Centro de Acción Legal Ambiental y Social de Guatemala. It's a pleasure to share with you our experiences. To start out, I would like to present to you the context of my country. We have a territory of 108,000 square kilometers, a population of 14 million inhabitants approximately, and in the small but very rich territory we have 4 different peoples. The Mayan people, which represent over 68% of the population, the Chinca people, Garifuna, and the non-indigenous peoples. Thanks to its geographical position in Central America, between North and South America, Guatemala has vast natural resources. And in 2010, Guatemala was listed as one of the countries in the world with the greatest variety of resources. Guatemala has protected areas which represent about 33% of the territory, and its greatest cultural wealth is represented by the men and women who live in the country and are building a Guatemala which is in search of equity. One should also speak of human rights and the environmental human rights that the Guatemalan constitution recognizes. Guatemala has a constitution which was approved in 1986, which represented a return to democracy after 30 years of military dictatorships. This constitution includes at least 10 articles which would provide for the environmental rights of the Guatemalan people. A healthy and balanced environment is referred to in Articles 64 and 97 of the Constitution, the right to water in particular, which is in Articles 127 and 128, and last but not least, the principle of access to water for the development of agriculture and other activities for the population in Article 128. Now let's talk about agribusiness in particular, which is the topic dealt with by this panel. There are 2 projects that have the greatest impact in Guatemala. First of all, there's the sugar industry, which is mainly on the Pacific coast of the country and which over the last few years, due to its expansion, has expanded and it extended towards the north in the departments of Alta Verapaz and Izabal. This sugar industry is mainly active in 5 departments. There is an association which in 2009 developed its activity in approximately 230,000 hectares, which according to experts the surface was increased due to the fact that sugar production has increased significantly in the country. And sugar canes now practically reach the coast of Guatemala. Sugar cane is basically being planted right next to the seashore. The second activity which has an impact in Guatemala is the African palm tree. According to experts, the annual production is 350,000 tons of palm oil, with 7 tons produced per hectare that is cultivated. 50,000 large services are used for the production of African palm trees, which are located along the coast, as well as in Izabal and Alta Verapaz, amongst others. We have the scenario now, and so we can now talk about human rights and business itself. The conclusion is quite simple. There is the violation of human right to water, violation of the human right to a healthy environment, mainly due to the sugar production, which is contaminating the waters, as well as the contamination of and pollution of the air. The main conclusion is that there is a lack of knowledge of this issue, the existence of human rights in the Republic of Guatemala, and this means, or has meant, that companies have focused their main interests and activities on corporate responsibility, and we believe that there isn't the level of conflict that exists in oil and gas industry, for example, where there might be a voluntary mechanism, and where there might at some point be a level of certification for the export of products, as most of the sugar production in Guatemala is for export. Lastly, we need to look at what the communities are doing about these violations of human rights. First of all, they are looking for procedures to be adopted in order to guarantee and remedy the human rights that have been violated by the sugar industry in the country. And currently, with the assistance of CALAS, the organization that I represent, they are carrying out studies and hope to submit reports to the Secretariat of Environmental Affairs and Trade in the Dominican Republic, Central America, and the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak at this important venue. Nestlé, as you may know, is the world's biggest food and beverage company. It is also a long-term company. It's been around for 150 years. It's a company with a long-term strategy, and we have as a basic principle, yes, companies are here to create value for their shareholders. They're here to generate profits. But companies are also here, and Nestlé in particular, to at the same time create value for society where they operate. And it is our firm belief that long-term success, business success of the company is closely linked to long-term success of the societies in which we operate. At the basis of this concept is, of course, the respect for local laws and international standards, among which human rights. We started integrating and developing human rights and developing a human rights due diligence together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights back in 2008. Today, we have a fully fledged human rights due diligence process, which includes 8 steps. Policies, starting with policies, then engagement with civil society and other stakeholders, training with obligatory training in high-risk countries and high-risk functions. We do risk assessments at the corporate level, at the supply chain level, at the community level, and in the countries in which we operate. We do detailed human rights impact assessments together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights. We've conducted 7 of those. We have a cross-functional coordination group within the company, and we have key partnerships such as the Danish Institute for Human Rights or the Fair Labor Association. And finally, we monitor and report and remediate on our human rights performance. We are actually just launching a white paper together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights on human rights impact assessments, the first 7 we have conducted, and the results and the way forward on these assessments. I believe it's one of the first times a company is doing this. The impact assessments cover both our own operations and our supply chain. We are a big company. We have 340,000 employees, direct employees, all over the world. 470 factories. Half of those factories are in developing countries, and half of them are in rural areas. We are a local company, a food and beverage company. We depend on agricultural raw materials. We don't own farms. We don't own any farms. We don't do contract farming either. But we work directly with more than 700,000 farmers, many of them smallholder farmers. We do source locally, we do process locally, and we market locally. So we're very decentralized. There are only 2 commodities, big commodities, which travel within the company, and that's coffee and cocoa. When we look at our upstream supply chain, agricultural supply chain, it is of course very big. I said 700,000 farmers with whom we have direct contact, with whom we work through technology exchange, access to finance, farmer development, through a network of 12,000 agricultural extension workers. And then further upstream, we have 6 to 7 million farmers from whom we source indirectly. We have our supplier code for direct first-tier suppliers, which are regularly audited, and we have responsible sourcing guidelines across 12 key commodities in the agricultural commodities, among which, of course, coffee, cocoa, sugarcane, but also palm oil. Both the supplier code and the responsible sourcing guidelines include human rights provisions, including land rights, including right to water, and so on. Just a brief word on cocoa to zoom in and to explain how we work on specific commodities. In cocoa, the big issue which was identified was child labor. The focus country, Ivory Coast. We developed a program together with the Fair Labor Association to detect child labor and remediate child labor. We had started with a certification approach. The problem with certification, despite all its qualities, it's that it is an exclusive program. It excludes those who do not meet the standards, whereas what is really needed to remediate child labor and other social issues in agriculture is an inclusive approach. So we do at the same time farmer development through the cocoa plan, replacement of plantlets, increase of productivity, and a child labor remediation program which is managed together with an external partner, the International Cocoa Initiative. We currently cover 8 cooperatives in the country. By the end of 2015, we will be covering 25% of our cocoa purchases in Côte d'Ivoire. And just as a reminder, we purchase about 10% of the cocoa Côte d'Ivoire produces. These efforts have been recognized, including in the latest report by Oxfam on when they looked at companies with agricultural supply chains and their impact. We did come out on top of this ranking, but Oxfam also clearly told us that there are a number of areas for improvement. One area we started looking at already earlier in the year was women in the cocoa supply chain. The next area we're currently looking in is land rights, access to land. It is a difficult one because, as I said, we do not own any farms, and we're currently working on the commitments on land rights. Let me conclude by just saying that no sustainable development on the ground in agriculture is actually possible without the private sector. What needs to happen is a better coordination and cooperation between the different actors of development, governments, civil society, NGOs, international organizations, and companies. Let's put the farmers back at the center of the attention. The farmers, farming systems, and livelihoods. And then I guess we have a fair chance of getting there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Frutiger. Before giving the word to the commentators, maybe just some highlights. I think now, from the perspective of agriculture sector, we have just three visions. And the first one related with the land issues, which is an issue in the agriculture sector all over the world. The second, I will say, two specific sectors highlighted by in Guatemala, the sugarcane in palm oil, and also how worldwide company as Nestlé is approaching these challenges, and also this strategy to use the impact assessment as a tool. And then I will give the word to Mr. Vladimir Evtimov to provide your comments.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we all heard that many of the problems that were shared by the presenters are related to rights to access to land and rights to access to natural resources. We know that there is a growing competition for natural resources. We also know that governing institutions face difficulties in adapting to an increasingly dynamic world. And we know that this world provides great opportunities, but also entails serious concerns, particularly when it comes to business and human rights. It's my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce the Voluntary Guidelines on the Responsible Governance of Tenure of Lands, Fisheries and Forests, which is directly related to the topic we discuss in this panel. It is a document which was endorsed by the Committee on World Food Security in 2012. And then many of you may be aware that the G8, G20, and Rio +20 encouraged countries to implement the guidelines. Then the UN General Assembly requested all relevant UN entities to ensure speedy dissemination and promotion of the guidelines. And we have had many encouraging signals from all stakeholder groups that the guidelines are of great importance and of sustained interest. Why is this so? Improved governance of tenure is essential. It is essential for food security. It is also essential for poverty eradication and for contributing to a good foundation for responsible investment. Millions of people depend on access to farmland and rangeland, to fisheries and to forests for their livelihoods. Secure and equitable access to natural resources is key for development. Improving governance of tenure is important, and it is important to do it in ways that reflect the interests of citizens, reconciling differences of opinions, and by ensuring that people are able to exercise their land rights and tenure rights and duties. The voluntary guidelines address all this. They provide a framework and an internationally recognized principles and practices that can be used to improve governance of tenure, improve tenure security, improve the access of people to natural resources, including for the states, for the civil society organizations, and for private businesses. They are voluntary and they do not establish legally binding obligations nor replace existing laws, treaties, and agreements, but they are useful because it is the experience of my organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, that voluntary agreements do influence national policies and laws. And when a country includes guidance of an international soft law like the voluntary guidelines, into its own laws, then the guidance of the voluntary document becomes hard law. The voluntary guidelines relate to the issues under consideration by this panel very directly. The guidelines place tenure rights firmly in the context of human rights. There is currently no international consensus that tenure rights is a human right, but on the other hand, tenure rights provide access to land, fisheries, and forests, and are important for the realization of human rights, such as the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being, including food and housing. In this respect, the voluntary guidelines cover a wealth of issues related to tenure governance, which in turn provides part of the foundation for responsible business practices and human rights, including the promotion of equal rights for women in securing access to land, the creation of transparent record-keeping systems for tenure rights, helping with recognition and protection of informal and customary rights, transfers and other changes to tenure rights and duties such as expropriation, compensation, restitution. So the voluntary guidelines can be a reference by states and for relevant policies and laws, and they can give investors and developers clear indications of what constitutes acceptable practice and due diligence. Just a few paragraphs that are in the voluntary guidelines. Business enterprises have a responsibility to respect human rights and legitimate tenure rights. Business enterprises should act with due diligence to avoid infringing on the human rights and legitimate tenure rights of others. And business enterprises should provide for and cooperate in non-judicial mechanisms to provide remedy where they have caused or contributed to adverse impacts on human rights and legitimate tenure rights. Where transnational corporations are involved, their home states have roles to play to ensure that businesses are not involved in abuse of human rights and legitimate tenure rights. And states should take additional steps to protect against abuses of human rights and legitimate tenure rights by business enterprises that are owned or controlled by the state. And just at the end of my comment, I would like to say that the Coca-Cola company recently has accepted in their own policy for sustainable investment that they will adhere to the voluntary guidelines for the responsible governance of tenure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vladimir, and then we'll have the comments from Ylva Stiller.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me here. I'm Ylva Stiller. I work for Syngenta, which is an agricultural input company. Many of the things that I heard from the panelists and my fellow commentator really resonates well with how we see the challenges ahead and what actually we are standing in front of, feeding 9 billion people by 2050. It's a huge challenge we all are facing. Just to put a little bit in context of trying to connect what our panelists here have been speaking about and what we do as a company. As I mentioned, Syngenta is an agricultural input company. That means that our customers are at the very beginning of the food chain. These are the growers and farmers that produce for all of our food and everything we eat and wear. We're about 28,000 people in 90 different countries, and we cater to smallholder farmers and large-scale farmers. When we talk about agriculture and human rights, these are, of course, two topics that are linked and very clearly linked. Our ambition as a company is to make a contribution to food security. And food security has everything to do with human rights. We talked about land rights, access to food, water, decent living, environmental rights was mentioned. So these concepts are really, really close to each other. Next to that, agriculture is the second largest employment sector in the world. It's estimated that 2.5 billion people depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. So, of course, labor standards is a big topic as well. And agricultural work can be quite hard. in rough climates and harsh conditions. So for us as an input provider, we recognize that we have a responsibility to help improve health and safety on the farm, upstream in our supply chain, but also downstream in our customer base. So to connect back to what some of the previous speakers have been talking about, when we started looking at where we could actually start working on human rights due diligence, labor standards were obviously one of the first places where we started to engage. And this was to understand and improve labor standards on our supply chain, and our seed supply chains in particular. We source from tens of thousands of farmers around the world. That means that we contract with smallholder farmers and large farmers to multiply our seeds in all geographies around the world. In 2003, we were alerted of child labor in our India supply chain. And ever since then, we've been working with the Fair Labor Association, very similar to what Nestlé is doing as well, to understand the local context better, implement better labor standards on the farm, but of course also monitor and agree on remediation plans for improved and continuous improvement on these farms. So looking at human rights and agriculture, it's very hard to separate these. As you heard, we firmly believe that businesses have a crucial role to play in changing the behavior on farms, being part of development in rural communities, and playing an active role. But this is a challenge that we all face. Companies won't do this alone. We need a multi-stakeholder approach to this. For us as a company, when we started looking at where are the biggest challenges as a company, where should we actually start engaging more proactively, we started looking at, yes, feeding 9 million people by 2050 within the limits of the planet. It's a huge challenge. We need inclusive solutions for smallholders to be part of this, because they will be part of unlocking this dilemma. And labor standards is right up there. For us, translating this ended up in a good growth plan. It's a company-wide targets for the company about what we need to do and how we need to measure our progress on these topics by 2020. We've set very ambitious goals for ourselves. We don't really have all the answers yet. And we need the partners and all of you in this room to help us figure out how we should get to this roadmap ahead. I think you've heard from all of us here and companies that have been speaking earlier in these couple of days is that we've started this journey on implementing human rights. We still have a way to go before we have been able to implement all the expectations of the guiding principles, but we're committed to this journey. And we have good peers that share our experience on this journey, and we're learning a lot from across different sectors. We have the opportunity to work together with other agricultural companies through the Fair Labor Association, but also through the GBI, Global Business Initiative on Human Rights, where we have a cross-sectoral approach. So I invite you to have a dialogue with us and see how we can improve our practices and how we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ylva. Then I will open the floor for questions. Then I would like to invite people from the states, business, and civil society to come forward and to give your questions for the panelists.
Thank you very much to the panel for presenting. The focus of this forum is obviously on business and human rights. What we may not have heard enough about is actually the commercial practices of business, that is their core business practices. We haven't heard anything about pricing. So I would just like to suggest that for the right to life to actually be operationalised, it is pretty important that workers and farmers in all supply chains are paid enough to live on. One of the things that we have been finding in our research, I work for a fair trade organisation, so one part is a social business and we have experience of buying. from developing countries and selling into the UK market. But on the NGO side, where we are doing research, we are finding extensive use of abusive commercial practices, very late payments, not paying when there are rejections that are spurious, changing volumes at very short notice, forcing businesses to pay for things that they have zero control over. And this goes all the way down the supply chain. The result is that workers are bearing risks for things they have absolutely no control over. In this capacity, we are doing work to encourage the European Union to enforce and to set up a mechanism that stops unfair commercial practices. And I would urge both companies on the panel to support an independent, tough enforcement mechanism at a European Union level. Obviously, if it could go global, that would be good, but at the moment there is an opportunity at a European level. And those businesses who do fair, ethical, legal, business-to-business practices have nothing to fear, and therefore should be in support of a tough, independent enforcement mechanism. I have a leaflet about it if people are interested.
Thank you. I will then take the question from the states. Is that so? And then come back with the civil society.
Thanks a lot. I'm from the German Institute for Human Rights and National Human Rights Institution. And we have been involved in the negotiation of these voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure of land, forests and fisheries. And I would like to pinpoint again how important this is, that this instrument is brought here to Geneva, because it's a real rights-based document based on the right to food and other economic, social, cultural rights. And in that sense, I think it's worthwhile. And I wanted to use that moment also to highlight that there is another process starting at the FAO with the beginning of next year, which is the development of responsible agricultural or principles for responsible agricultural investments. And I think that is a process which should be closely linked to what is discussed here in Geneva and also with the working group, because that will be a process where it's about to decide or define a bit more what are in an essence principles, how you can do responsible investments in agriculture. And it will be a challenge to get a rights-based approach being used in the FAO premises when the negotiations will be there. And it's also good to get support from companies, but also from civil society organizations in that process to really get a good document out of this, because that could be a good guidance in the next years for all those interested in investing in agriculture. And as we have heard, there is a strong need to invest more in agriculture. And there's also a competition already on access to these resources, so a very competitive environment where investments takes place. And many of these conflicts on access to resources probably can only be solved if a strong rights-based approach is applied. I wanted to highlight this process, and I think the link would be extremely important that the human rights system and the let's say the FAO system in the United Nations really strongly collaborate in this area, and also the actors which are present here. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. I will take another question for civil society.
Dilberto Trujillo de la Red Internacional.
Mr. Trujillo, in 2007, Chiquita Brand, the multinational, they'd supported a military group that had killed thousands and thousands of people. They received a fine, but no one was sent to prison, and the victims were never received any remedy. And especially the farmers who had been opposed to the exploitation carried out by Chiquita. This is to do with sovereignty and food security. The farmers are seriously affected. Their life is at risk, and there is also access to food for thousands of people. This is why my association would like to urge the working group and the governments to define clear policies on land use. The policies that are being suggested worldwide, be it in Africa, America, and even countries in Asia. Similarly, it is urgent that the guiding principles be accepted as a valid and important tool for farmers' organizations. If there is a sector that is not familiar with the guiding principles, it is the farming sector and farmers. Multinationals have abused of and will continue to do so, farmers. Furthermore, we need to have as an objective to strengthen farmers' rights throughout the world. On the 2nd of December, a farmer called César García, who was opposed to the process of exploitation of the gold mining in Colombia, a mine that is going to leave a lot of people without land, was assassinated. We believe that these crimes against farmers, not only in Colombia but throughout the world, are going unpunished. And all farmers want is the right to land and the possibility to continue to produce those foods that are being consumed worldwide. Thank you very much.
I will let the panelists answer the questions, and then later we'll take another round. I will ask if the companies can comment on the issues relating commercial practices and also capacity building on human rights, what the efforts are. Maybe Mr. Vladimir can also talk about the issues on land issues, Mr. from the commissions also. Also, I think the legal perspective also will be good to have it this here. And then maybe Christian, can you start?
Okay, thank you. On pricing, I finished my presentation by talking about the importance of putting the farmer back at the center and looking at livelihoods, farming systems, and actually beyond individual commodities. It's really looking at entire farming systems. It is absolutely in our interest to have strong and resilient farming systems. We invest locally in the long term, in a long-term supply chain. We don't own farms, I repeat. We don't contract farm. We buy from farmers who can also sell to somebody else. So yes, we absolutely need strong farming systems. And we need fair pricing, indeed. Farmers need to be able to make a living. And this is why we need to look at livelihoods and not only at single commodities. Enforceable mechanisms, I am not so sure. I actually have the impression, and practice seems to show, that direct work on the ground, directly with companies, is much faster and much more effective. And we see it in those countries in which we work. The challenge we have, and all of us have, is the complexity of some of these supply chains, the traceability. It's of essence to be able to trace agricultural raw materials throughout the entire supply chain, which also helps eliminate the pressure points where undue pressure is exceeded. In terms of the voluntary on the principles for sustainable agricultural investment, a very interesting initiative. There is also another initiative going on, which is taking place between the UN Global Compact, the private sector, and FAO, plus a few other institutions, on sustainable business principles for agriculture, which looks at the entire spectrum of economic, social, and environmental indicators with a very strong human rights based approach. It's actually chaired by one of the members of the UN Working Group. So there is definitely also an avenue. Education for farmers is key. I mentioned our responsible sourcing guidelines across 12 commodities. It is critical that farmers know their rights and their obligations, and how to ensure that their rights are respected. And this needs a collective effort. Yes, companies have to do their part, but like Ylva said, civil society also has to do their part. Governments have to regulate locally, implement the regulation, create a level playing field, and jointly, and we are seeing it at least in the beginning on the child labor issue in Ivory Coast, we will succeed. So there are all the actors of development have to play the role. Thank you.
Ylva, then.
I can just echo what Christian already told you there. What is also what we're also looking into through the Fair Labor Association is the concept of living wage and trying to understand what would be the appropriate one, and have a consensus within the whole tripartite setup of the Fair Labor Association, how to move forward on that and implement that. But apart from that, what we've also been looking into is impact assessment that actually goes beyond the farm setting and look into the models that we are implementing on the farm. Do they have the expected impacts of the farm? So back in the community, does it have those impacts that we are, or the improvements that we are hoping that we will have with the changing labor standards and wage standards as well? And we are at the very beginning of this to try to understand this better. We have done some pilots and want to scale this up to then know what are the levers and where we need to change this. But it is a concerted effort that has to take place here, and it's definitely in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question first. Yes, it is very important that international instruments like the Voluntary Guidelines on the Responsible Governance of Tenure are developed in a very participatory manner. And in this respect, I should say that the development process of the guidelines was unprecedentedly participatory. It was done in the Committee of World Food Security with the participation of more than 1,000 people in more than 15 global meetings. And then the negotiations took place for about 3 weeks in 3 sessions, and 130 countries participated, and also a unique mechanism for participation of civil society was established at that negotiation. And also private sector and academia participated very actively in the negotiations. So all this knowledge and all this experience on how to prepare a participatory document will be used also in the negotiation of the next one coming, and it is the Principles of Responsible Agricultural Investment document. But this participatory approach created an extraordinary degree of ownership by all stakeholders, and it sets a firm ground for implementation of such documents. I would say that FAO as an international organization supports countries mostly in the implementation of the voluntary guidelines. And so far we have had over 22 requests from individual countries to somehow integrate parts of the voluntary guidelines into their national legislation. But we are open to all partners, and we are setting up partnerships with civil society and private businesses for the implementation of those principles in the voluntary guidelines, which are responsibility of civil society and business enterprises. And also FAO is now developing a new approach to monitoring and evaluation of the situation with tenure rights worldwide. And very soon we will be supporting the inclusion of land tenure as one of the indicators in the post-2015 development agenda. So I think that the only way forward is if everyone represented in this room work together and join their efforts to achieving human rights. Thank you.
Microphone, please, for the speaker. Microphone, please, for the speaker.
Hay que partir de una base.
One should use a common basis, a foundation, where human rights have to be respected, and it's up to each and every government, each and every person, each and every firm to respect them on the whole. One should bear in mind that the legal framework in all countries have included these rights, and they therefore have to be enforced. I think in the case of Guatemala, Latin America on the whole, and specifically Guatemala, the main goal of industries will be to see in human rights an opportunity and not an obstacle. Even though, as we know, firms in Guatemala have been on the side of the military who have seriously violated human rights, and that was in the 70s and 80s. Even though they come from a school where they believe, well, and that is where they believe that human rights are an obstacle to economic development. However, and we have seen that firms were subjected to the wishes of the government. However, human rights in the context of international trade represent a huge opportunity. The final consumer knows that a firm is respecting human rights and making the efforts required to ensure that workers and communities and the people living in their environment are in harmony with the economic development, well, they will prefer those products to the products of firms that support the military activities of certain governments. Thank you very much.
Then another round of questions. If someone from the business and states would like to also to add some questions, I will start then with the business.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Firms in Guatemala, in the context of human rights, and I'm referring to labor principles and environmental principles, belong to a legal sector, formal sector, and I would say that for the most part they respect the minimum standards of the law. We do believe that it is necessary for the institutionality of the state to be strengthened in order to ensure the enforcement of the law in the labour sector and in the environmental sector, mainly for the 80% of the economic activity in the country, which pertains to the informal sector. And I'm referring to what was said yesterday about the consistency of the programs being considered by the United Nations, and in particular the principles of human rights in firms. It is important to know that programs such as family agriculture and so on are programs that could contribute to assisting many of the families that benefit from the programs of the United Nations, and these programs should guarantee that there be no promotion of violation of rights. Many boys, girls and adolescents in Guatemala work, and 68% of them belong to family groups, mainly in the farming activities, where these children work without receiving income, and they work without going through any type of education whatsoever. The Guatemalan state does not guarantee that all children receive education, and the number of hours that of education that they should be following per week. 50% or over 50%, in fact, of the informal sector in the country is concentrated in farming activities where minimum wage isn't guaranteed and workers don't have access to social security either. Whereas it is important to guarantee that all people receive minimum wage and a wage that is in line with the law and that they have social coverage. Thank you.
For the question, and then the civil society, please.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to refer to the following. What mechanisms could the working group implement to ensure the follow-up of the implementation of agribusiness policies and the right to food in Guatemala? 78% of fertile land is concentrated in in the hands of 8% of owners in the country, and only 22% of this land belongs to smallholders. Smallholders produce, however, 71% of of corn, which is the staple ingredient in the Guatemalan diet. And we've seen an increase in the production of the African palm and sugarcane, amongst others. Between 2010 and 2011, these products increased by over 140%. There were just over 80,000 hectares in 2008, and in 2009 they increased to 230,000 hectares, and this also relates to the quantity of land used to cover the right to food. And this is in country Guatemala, which is one where there is the greatest inequity worldwide, and where a large number of children suffer from undernourishment. I would also like to speak about a few issues that the working group should focus on. Should urge states to improve the supervision as to the right to food, and also work on labor guarantees for workers. Our colleague was speaking about our country earlier on, and the workers of the sugarcane industry, for example, do not have the right to have a trade union. And it is in the agricultural sector that there is the least respect for the payment of minimum wage. We would therefore like to search for a series of mechanisms so that the working group could follow up on these various issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Your question, please.
Muchas gracias. En este tema quería referirme y decir y hacer un llamado al
I would like to refer in this statement to something. I'd like to appeal to businesses. First of all, I need to say that it's encouraging to see the fact that you're actually listening to us now and that you're raising the question of the guiding principles and human rights. We indigenous peoples, as has been said by my brothers and sisters here, we live on our land. Land is important to us. Land will go to our future generations. What's going on currently is that the ambition of certain businesses actually threatens the livelihood of our future generations because the land will not go to them. The ambitions of these businesses continue to grow. What's therefore being threatened is the very future of generations of children. We, with this growing ambition of always more money, we are trying to look at different types of seeds that can be used. It's essential that the United Nations begin to study this issue. Particularly what I'm speaking about is the use of different types of seeds. We need to look at its impact not only on land quality, but also see how they're linked to illnesses and disease that can affect peoples. We need to make sure that advances in science or in technology do not threaten people's lives. Thank you.
Thanks for your comment. I will like some of the questions were specifically for, I will say, for the context in Latin America. But then I would like that Rafael can address some aspects. First of all, I will say if you have information or comments about the informal sector and how can we address that issue in terms of the labor rights and human rights. Also, I would like to hear from the companies some in a larger perspective how we can also partner or work together in issues like the last one about transgenic and products and how we can address those kind of issues. And of course, if the Vladimir has some comments from FAO also on these issues, we will welcome them. Thanks.
Señora Presidente, es obvio que como lo comentaba la
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's quite clear that, as was said by my colleague, there are a lot of people working in the informal sector, but not only in agriculture. It's also in trade and other activities where the informal sector has increased significantly, and this is because the state is not adopting policies that enable these people to enter the formal sector. Now, one of the important things for Guatemala is sustainable development, a way in which natural resources can be used in an efficient way which guarantees that future generations will also be able to use them. And it's also a matter of ensuring that the economic benefits trickle down to all those who should enjoy them. I think if the Guatemalan state focuses on these, they will achieve better results, and this forum is an excellent opportunity for the Guatemalans, governments, firms, and civil society start, first of all, working on agribusiness and human rights, which we must all accept are a relatively unknown topic in the country, and use the tools to promote the development of our country. Thank you.
I don't know if someone else would like to comment.
Okay. To the civil society questions, yes, absolutely. Right to food should prevail. There is competition out there, obviously, and one big competition comes from food crops which are being used for biofuels. It is an interesting perspective, but obviously problematic in terms of food security and right to food. So yes, the right to food should prevail, be that for food crops or cash crops, but basically destined to sustain livelihoods. We're back to the concept of the livelihoods. Obviously, there is a need for a balance between big farming and smallholder farming, but many say that the future for feeding the future 9 billion people on the world is in smallholder farming, and we as big companies have a clear interest in that as well. Access to freedom of association, organization, be that through trade unions or cooperatives, absolutely, it is important that the farmers can be represented and that they have a certain level of bargaining power. The limits of the planetary boundaries, land doesn't grow. I fully agree with you. Not only does it not grow in Guatemala, it doesn't grow anywhere else either. So yes, we have to be able to produce more, probably with less resources and inputs within the planetary boundaries to guarantee also a future for our children. A lot of this, and again, agriculture is not rocket science. A lot of this can be achieved through good agricultural practices, a rights-based approach, but then good agricultural practices, training at all levels, and that requires a concerted effort. On the seeds and GMOs, I probably refer to my colleague from Syngenta.
So for me, it was not clear if it was seeds in general or it was GMOs in particular. The question was. I think it was in general. It was in general. So I think in terms of access to seeds and what kind of seeds that are more effective in a local area, you know probably better than I do that varieties are so localized that they're varieties that work better in particular areas. Within Guatemala, you have several different climatic zones, so you will have different seeds that work better in different parts depending on altitude and a number of other things, soil, precipitation, and a number of other things. Our view as a seed company is naturally to offer a wide set of technologies for farmers to use. But GM is just one tool in the toolbox. It's not the fix-it-all for all situations. So I think what you mentioned is if we're talking about farm-saved seeds, access to different types of seed varieties, yes, this is the key to unlock better productivity. And any type and all types of agricultural practices are important to do this. I'm not sure if I fully responded to your question, but that is as far as I understood it. Otherwise, happy to connect afterwards to continue discussions.
There are more questions from the floor? We have some minutes. Well, if not, I will just make some, like a final comment. I've been listening to... Oh, yes.
Microphone for the speaker.
From business from the floor. I actually would like to ask one. So the first point is a point I want to make, and I couldn't agree more with Rafael. For companies, definitely human rights are an opportunity. And we often speak, we have already more companies this time at the second annual forum. I think it's about 85 companies, but there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of companies out there that are not in this room. So one message maybe to bring out there is that yes, human rights are an opportunity for companies to do business sustainably. Now, my question is to civil society. And we hear a lot of accusations against companies, a lot of campaigning, a lot of litigation. And, you know, don't forget that companies are also to a greater extent, part of civil society. They're composed of individuals who are part of civil society. And individuals function through incentives much better often than through attacks. So incentives, and this is just an example, Oxfam earlier this year launched this scorecard comparing 10 companies with agricultural supply chains on their impact on land, water, environment, women, farmers, farm workers, and so on. Very rights-based approach. They did a ranking of the top 10 companies. The first ranking came out in March. We did come out on top. The second ranking came out about a couple of months ago. What was interesting is that almost all companies had progressed quite significantly in their performance between the two rankings. So in the 6th month, sort of a race was launched, and companies wanted to perform better than their competitors. We've heard from Vladimir that Coke just committed to the voluntary guidelines on land tenure. The request from Oxfam when they launched the second scorecard was that companies look specifically at land tenure. So Coca-Cola signed up to the guidelines. Nestlé is exploring the voluntary guidelines, and I'm sure Unilever and others are doing the same. So a question and a message, maybe from time to time, a word of encouragement or a word of recognition can speed things up dramatically. And I believe in the matter of human rights and business, if we want to make an impact, at the end of the day, at the lowest level, with the rights holder, speed is of essence. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And since the rules do not allow the question in the other way, then I will let just, because of the minutes, I will let few answers to what is just being asked.
Hello, my name's Phil Bloomer. I'm currently the director of the Business and Human Rights, but I've come from 18 years working at Oxfam, so I'd like to answer the question. I think the point that you make is a very important one. How do you get change in companies? And how do we get change that's actually going to make a difference to poor people, vulnerable people, at the end of the supply chains that you manage? I think it's clear that there are companies that want to make significant shifts, and they need encouragement. But even those companies often shift very slowly. Many of the advocates like yourself inside the company that are seeking to boldly move the company towards human rights need support. Some of that support will come from providing the kind of feedback, positive feedback to the moves that you make. But I think also you should see that the attacks, when they come on the abuse that happens at the end of the supply chain, is also helpful to you as an advocate inside your company. I think you would probably admit that the fact that Coca-Cola has moved finally on to make zero tolerance in its on land grabs in its supply chains is the result of a campaign where 250,000 people across the world signed up a petition on Coca-Cola. That will now lead, hopefully, without further campaigning, to PepsiCo and others signing up to that zero tolerance. But it's because of the campaigning that that has happened. That then should be built on by people like yourselves and by civil society
praising moves when they move in the right direction, but also sustaining the pressure and criticism, which I hope you would welcome in the future when it comes, and use it strategically inside the company. Thank you.
Thanks. I have like 4 minutes. Then if there is one question.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, initially I wanted to ask Nestlé and Syngenta, but I also want to take the opportunity to ask the governments. We've been talking today, yesterday and today, a lot about multi-stakeholder initiatives, and that the way forward is through public-private partnerships and through multi-stakeholder initiatives. Now, many governments sitting here haven't ratified ILO Convention 129 on labor inspection, while many have ratified Convention 81 on labor inspection in industry. They haven't done it for agriculture. And I'm sitting here listening to all the activities that Nestlé and Syngenta are trying to put in place to actually try to get greater compliance on labor issues in agriculture. And I'm thinking, you know, where are the synergies between the government's labor inspection services in agriculture and Syngenta, Nestlé, and the rest of the companies? Do you guys have initiatives going on to collaborate with labor inspectorates? And do the governments have projects and initiatives and intentions of actually getting better compliance, ensuring free no association, no child labor, et cetera, within the agro?
Thank you. And then I will take the last question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Ylva. I'm from Cambodia. I'm working for the NGO called Equitable Cambodia. My organization is working very closely with Oxfam also, and recently we, Oxfam used one of the case study in Cambodia related to land grabbing, and in Koh Kong province, as Dr. Nirun mentioned. So I have 2 questions actually. One request and another question to Nestlé. You mentioned that your company is operating in developing countries and in rural area. And my question is, how can you ensure that your company is not, contributing to the land grabbing or human rights abuses in the ground? Because in the developing countries, they are, have the not a very strong legal framework. In the case of Cambodia, there's a lot of land grabbing and human rights abuses, and especially in the rural area. My second question or request is to the EU government, because Cambodia is one of the least developing countries and currently benefiting from the policy called Everything But Arms policy. And this policy encourages many companies from the European countries, like the UK company in the region, like company in the region as well. And when this company come to Cambodia doing business, they are not respecting the country or domestic law or the Cambodian law, and also they are not respecting the European policy as well. So now my organization and others organization and community has called EU to assess the the human rights impacts of the policy. Thank you. That's all my question.
My experience in ASEAN and Southeast Asia, I have 2 points to emphasize in the end of the seminar. Number one is I think that the right to access to the natural resource is very important in the small and medium farm in Southeast Asia, even in ASEAN. The case of the Koh Kong is one of the many cases that I call for by the people, but we have the case in Taiwan, the case by the dam in China, or even in Laos, Dam Sayaburi, or in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Even the Tawai mega project. Every project is a mega project that use a lot of land, that disturb about the right of life and right self-determination of the people. Especially yesterday, we listened about the Joseph Stiglitz. I think that the most influence about the government part and combined with the private sector is what we call the neoliberal economic status. So the problem is that it influence about the land, that disturb about the people, because the people in the small medium farm in the Southeast Asia and even in the river region, they need to maintain the life and the culture. But if disturbed by the big project or mega project, I think this is the disturb and make what we call the inequality. The Joseph write the book, The Price of the Inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor is very much important in the Southeast Asia and even in ASEAN for the poor people. So I believe that the CSR is the process aiming to suit and give the remedy to those affected or exploited by the project of a company. Because CSR should never be viewed as any form of the funding race or social event, but it must be viewed as the corporate ethical value with human-based, right-based approach. And CSR now is a new concept, namely the Global Compact. That is mean that once the state must prevent and protect human rights violation. So I think that the principle PPP, the polluted pay principle, by the study of EHIA, by the people participation, by to try to make the EHIA before the project, is the prevention for any mega project disturb and violent for the human right. And we call for the private sector shall encourage the corporate social response to respect of the law, because the problem in the Southeast Asia is the problem of the rule of law by the government part. And think that the framework also demands the remedy to be given to those violated and encourage the community to unite and build their strength among themselves.
Well, thanks a lot for joining us in this panel. Maybe just one last word or message from my side. I have been listening that collaboration and ownership of initiative is the key. But I would like to say that we need to create capacities in order to have a same level dialogue, because otherwise this dialogue of this collaboration cannot have a good impact that we are looking for. Then thanks a lot for joining this panel, and thanks the panelists and commentators.